It began like any other quiet suburban morning in Columbia, Illinois. The birds were already chirping softly as the first light of dawn spilled across manicured lawns and white-trimmed houses. Children were waking up in their rooms, parents brewed coffee, and life went on with the comforting rhythm of routine. But on this morning, May 5th, 2009, something broke that rhythm in a way that would send shockwaves far beyond the sleepy Midwestern town. Christopher Coleman, a security chief for one of the world's largest televangelist ministries, dialed his supervisor at work around 7 a.m. He told them he'd been trying to reach his wife, Sheri, but she wasn't answering. It wasn't like her to sleep in, he explained. Something felt wrong. He was concerned. He asked if they could send someone over to check, just to be safe. The call felt casual at first, perhaps overly casual, but that would soon be overshadowed by what authorities found inside the Coleman home. When officers entered through an unlocked window, they were greeted not by a peaceful domestic scene, but by horror. The house was deathly silent. The air was still heavy with something unspoken. And as they made their way from room to room, the silence gave way to screams from their radios. Sheri Coleman, 31 years old, was found strangled in bed. Nearby, their two sons, Garrett, 11, and Gavin, 9, were also discovered in their bedrooms. All three were lifeless. All three had been strangled. The rooms were vandalized with hateful scrawled messages in red spray paint. Phrases like, "Punished," "I told you this would happen," and "You have paid," were smeared across the wall. It was staged to look like a targeted killing, a vendetta from someone with a grudge against the family. At first glance, it seemed the work of a deranged outsider. But investigators would soon realize they were staring into the heart of something far more chilling. A calculated, cold-blooded execution by a man who wore the mask of protector, provider, and believer. Chris Coleman had served in the Marine Corps before becoming head of security for Joyce Meyer, a world-renowned Christian evangelist whose sermons were broadcast globally. He traveled internationally. He was trusted, respected. His job was to ensure safety, especially in a ministry that had, over the years, received threats from angry critics. In fact, that's where things started to get complicated. Months before the murders, Chris had reported receiving threatening emails. The emails were sinister. They warned that his family was at risk, that his work with the ministry was endangering his wife and children. They referenced the televangelist herself, Joyce Meyer, and included details suggesting that whoever was sending them knew about Chris's work, his schedule, and even his home life. To his bosses, it seemed like a legitimate concern. They took it seriously. Chris was their head of security, after all. If he said there was a threat, it was treated as credible. But to police, the emails were strange. They came from an anonymous Yahoo account. They were formatted awkwardly. The grammar was inconsistent. And the tone shifted from message to message. Some were cold and angry. Others were oddly emotional, almost melodramatic. The more investigators looked into the threats, the more they began to suspect that the sender wasn't some radical outside the family. The sender, they feared, was much closer to home. In the days following the murders, police began examining Chris's movements. Where had he been? Who had seen him? What did he know, and what wasn't he saying? He told officers he'd left the house around 5:43 a.m. to go to the gym. He claimed he had sent text messages to Sheri later that morning trying to check in. When she didn't respond, he grew concerned and called the police. But surveillance footage at the gym showed inconsistencies. Chris had lingered in the parking lot for an unusually long time before going in. And during his time at the gym, he didn't seem particularly concerned. No urgent phone calls, no frantic messages, just a man going through the motions. Meanwhile, investigators discovered something even more damning. Chris Coleman was having an affair. Her name was Tara Lintz, a woman from Florida who had once been friends with Sheri. Their relationship had escalated over months. Phone calls, intimate emails, hotel stays. Tara believed Chris would soon divorce Sheri. He'd even told her he planned to marry her. But in the teachings of Joyce Meyer Ministries, divorce was taboo, especially for someone in a leadership role like Chris. He couldn't risk losing his position. He couldn't risk scandal. He couldn't be exposed as a cheater. So, police began asking an increasingly horrifying question. Had Chris Coleman murdered his wife and children, not in a fit of rage, not by accident, but as part of a plan to erase the obstacles to his new life? As the investigation deepened, forensics played a critical role. The autopsy reports were devastating. Sheri had been strangled with a ligature, possibly a cord or rope. Her face showed signs of a violent struggle. The children's deaths were just as brutal. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of anyone else being in the house. Then came the handwriting analysis. The spray-painted threats on the walls, their lettering, style, and slant, closely resembled Chris Coleman's own writing. Experts weren't just guessing. They made side-by-side comparisons. The matches were striking. In the emails, a breakthrough came when investigators traced the IP address. Despite being sent from an anonymous Yahoo account, the emails had originated from Chris's own laptop. Even more incriminating, deleted drafts of the threatening messages were recovered from the hard drive. It became clear Chris had not only fabricated the threats, he had used them to build a story, a shield, and eventually an alibi. But his plan had flaws. The timeline didn't hold. His behavior didn't match a concerned husband and father. And worst of all, his digital footprints betrayed him. In a chilling move, police placed Chris under surveillance, even as they continued their investigation. They recorded his calls, they tracked his movements. They listened to him speak with Tara Lentz as if nothing had happened. Just days after his family was found murdered, Chris was discussing baby names with her. He was planning their future. On May 19, 2009, just 2 weeks after the murders, Chris Coleman was arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. The news stunned the community, shocked the church, and devastated those who had once believed in the image of a devoted husband and father. But the story was far from over. And the prosecution had a mountain of circumstantial evidence, yes, but they still needed to convince a jury that Chris Coleman, a former Marine, a trusted security officer, and a Christian father, had deliberately planned and executed the murder of his own family to escape his responsibilities and begin a new life with his mistress. It would be one of the most emotionally charged trials in Illinois history, and it was only just beginning. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. The trial of Christopher Coleman was more than just a legal proceeding. It was a public reckoning. News outlets had dubbed it the Family Annihilator case, and speculation swirled around every sordid detail. How could a man so seemingly grounded in faith and family commit such an atrocity? The answer, prosecutors argued, was chillingly simple: ambition, desire, and the selfish hunger for a new life, one without the ties of responsibility. But first, the state had to present their case with clarity and force. They needed to dismantle the image Chris had so carefully cultivated: a loyal husband, doting father, and man of God. Prosecutors began with the timeline. Chris had claimed he left for the gym just before 6 a.m. on the morning of the murders. He said he had no contact with his family after that and returned home only after trying to reach Sheri and receiving no reply. But surveillance footage showed Chris taking an unusually long time before entering the gym. Witnesses noted he didn't seem anxious or distressed. He worked out like it was any other day. The state argued this behavior was far from that of a concerned husband. They suggested a more sinister explanation. Chris had already murdered Sheri and the boys before leaving for the gym. His entire routine that morning was part of a calculated cover-up. Next came the forensic evidence. Sheri and the children were strangled in their beds. No defensive wounds on the children, which indicated they may have been killed in their sleep. Sheri, however, showed signs of a struggle. Her bruises, the trauma to her neck and face, told a story of terror. Investigators found no signs of forced entry. Nothing had been taken. The doors were locked, and the only open point was a window, one that officers believe was left open by Chris himself to stage a break-in. Then there were the spray-painted messages. "I told you this would happen. You have paid." The state brought in handwriting experts who compared the graffiti to samples of Chris's writing. The similarities were undeniable. Not only that, but they found remnants of red spray paint on Chris's clothing. tiny flecks barely visible to the eye, but unmistakable under lab analysis. Even more damning was the digital trail. The threatening emails Chris had been receiving over the previous months were traced back to his own laptop. Investigators recovered drafts of the emails from the hard drive, even after Chris had deleted them. The IP address linked back to his home network. There was no phantom stalker. There was only Chris. One of the most pivotal moments in the trial came when prosecutors revealed the extent of his affair with Tara Lentz. Tara was called to testify. She appeared uncomfortable, clearly shaken, but she answered the questions. She admitted their relationship had become romantic months before the murders. They exchanged explicit photos. They planned a future together. Chris had told her he was divorcing Sheri. He had even given her a date, May 4th, 2009, the day before Sheri and the boys were killed. Tara testified that Chris promised her they'd be married by the end of the year. He said he couldn't be with her while still married to Sheri. He told her he'd never get custody of the boys, and he didn't want to lose his job with Joyce Meyer Ministries. Divorce was not an option, he'd explained. He needed a clean break. The courtroom fell silent, as those two words echoed through the prosecution's closing arguments. Clean break. A clean break that involved erasing his entire family. Joyce Meyer herself was brought to the stand. In a rare move, she agreed to testify. She confirmed that her ministry had a zero-tolerance policy on adultery and would have terminated Chris had his affair come to light. She also acknowledged that Chris never informed her about the supposed threats against his family, despite being the head of her security team. That omission spoke volumes. Meanwhile, the defense scrambled to create doubt. They argued that the case was circumstantial. There were no eyewitnesses, no video footage, no confession. They suggested it was possible someone else had committed the crime. Someone with a vendetta against Chris or Joyce Meyer Ministries. They hinted at disgruntled employees, stalkers, or anti-religious extremists. But these claims felt hollow without evidence. They also tried to portray Chris as a man under extreme pressure. His job, his marriage, his personal life were collapsing. The threats, whether real or self-made, were a cry for help, not a prelude to murder. They painted him as desperate, not diabolical. But the jury wasn't convinced. The evidence was overwhelming. The lies, the fabricated emails, the affair, the timeline, it all pointed to one conclusion. Chris Coleman had not only planned the murder of his family, he had executed it with chilling precision. On May 5, 2011, exactly 2 years to the day after the murders, Chris Coleman was found guilty on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But the legal resolution did little to soothe the pain left behind. Sheri's family was devastated. Her parents had once considered Chris a son. They had no warning, no suspicion. They struggled with the realization that the man they had loved and trusted had been plotting behind their backs. Even more tragic was the loss of Garrett and Gavin, 2 young boys with their lives ahead of them. They loved sports, video games, and sleepovers. Garrett dreamed of becoming a pilot. Gavin wanted to be a firefighter. Their friends at school left flowers at their desks. Teachers cried during morning announcements. The entire community grieved. In the aftermath, the Coleman family home was torn down. The structure where so much horror occurred was erased, replaced by grass and silence, a symbolic attempt to reclaim the neighborhood from the darkness. But the memory lingered. The case became a haunting symbol of how evil can hide behind the facade of faith. Chris had lived a double life, devout on the outside, deceptive within. He quoted scripture while planning murder. He protected others while destroying his own. In later years, the case would be the subject of books, documentaries, and podcasts. People couldn't stop asking, how does someone go so far? How does a man strangle his own children and return to the gym as if nothing happened? Psychologists weighed in, calling Chris a narcissist, a sociopath, a textbook case of family annihilator syndrome, men who kill their own families to escape perceived burdens and start over. But labels offered little comfort. For many, the Chris Coleman case remains one of the darkest chapters in modern American true crime. It wasn't just the act, It was the betrayal, the calculated planning, the loss of innocence. In the end, it wasn't a stranger who broke into the house and took everything away. It was the man who lived there, the man who kissed his sons goodnight, the man who vowed to love, honor, and protect, and the man who chose a lie over their lives. When the world looked at Chris Coleman before May 2009, it saw the picture of moral uprightness. A former Marine turned security chief for a global Christian ministry, he projected calm confidence and spiritual integrity. But beneath the carefully constructed image, investigators would discover an unraveling man obsessed with control, driven by lust, and ultimately devoid of conscience. The unraveling didn't happen overnight. It was a process, subtle, calculated, and invisible to those who loved and trusted him most. Chris had been married to Sheri for over a decade. They met when he was still in the Marines, and Sheri was a fitness instructor. By all appearances, they were the perfect couple. Sheri, vivacious and deeply kind, threw herself into raising their 2 boys and supporting Chris's career. She was often described as a light in the room. She was the kind of person who didn't just smile, she lit up those around her. But behind closed doors, cracks were forming. Friends would later recall that Sheri seemed increasingly isolated. Chris was controlling, they said, subtly but persistently. He dictated her wardrobe, discouraged certain friendships, and insisted on appearances that matched his image. Sheri, ever loyal, tried to maintain peace. She didn't confide in many people, but some close friends later revealed she had started to feel uneasy, suspicious even. By late 2008, Sheri suspected Chris was cheating. At first, she tried to rationalize it. Long hours, constant travel, emotional distance. But as the clues added up, late-night texting, unaccounted time, secretive phone calls, she confronted him. Chris denied everything. He told her she was imagining things, that she was being paranoid. But she wasn't. Chris had been seeing Tara Lintz for months by then. Tara lived in Florida. She had known both Chris and Sheri for years. She was a former friend of Sheri's. When their relationship turned romantic, it was kept under wraps. Chris and Tara exchanged emails through private accounts. They met during work trips. He sent her gifts, photos, promises. He told her he loved her, that he wanted to spend the rest of his life with her. He also told her that Sheri was the problem, that she was abusive, unstable, and emotionally distant. He portrayed himself as a victim, trapped in a loveless marriage, unable to escape because of his job, his kids, his faith. To Tara, it was a tragic love story. To prosecutors, it was the motive. Investigators unearthed dozens of intimate emails and text messages. In one message, Chris said he was working on things and promised they would be together by the end of May. In another, he told her to pick out engagement rings. They discussed baby names. He told her they'd be married by the end of 2009. One email was timestamped just days before the murders. Chris wrote, "Everything's almost over. Just a few more days and I'll be free." Free. That word would echo through the halls of justice like a death knell. But how does someone go from lying to murder? How does a man decide that ending 3 innocent lives is the path to liberation? To understand Chris's actions, experts began peeling back layers of psychological dysfunction. Clinical psychologists, who later studied the case, pointed to narcissistic personality traits. Chris, they believed, had an inflated sense of entitlement. He saw his wife and children not as people with emotions, dreams, and lives, but as obstacles. In his mind, they stood between him and happiness. And once he concluded that divorce would threaten his career, his solution wasn't to sacrifice his job or his mistress. It was to erase the problem. Family annihilators often follow a terrifying pattern. They're typically male, often viewed as upstanding citizens. They kill not out of a sudden burst of rage, but as a coldly calculated decision to start over, without shame or consequence. For them, the family becomes collateral damage in their quest for reinvention. In Chris's case, the threat of public exposure was intolerable. Joyce Meyer Ministries had strict rules about morality. Adultery wasn't just frowned upon, It was grounds for immediate dismissal. His reputation, his finances, his sense of worth, all were tied to his image as a faithful man. So rather than endure scandal, he plotted a theatrical lie, a mysterious stalker, a series of threats, a break-in, a brutal murder that pointed away from him. It was elaborate, diabolical, and ultimately doomed to fail. As the trial continued, witnesses painted a clearer picture of Chris's dual life. Co-workers described him as professional but aloof. He kept to himself. He wasn't known for warmth or friendliness. His job required vigilance, but some noted he seemed robotic, mechanical in his interactions, always focused on optics. Neighbors, on the other hand, recalled him differently. He was cordial, active in his church, and frequently seen playing with his sons in the yard. But after the murders, many admitted they felt something off about him in retrospect, something they couldn't quite place. Perhaps most telling were the testimonies from Sheri's close friends. One recalled Sheri confiding her fears that Chris had changed. She said he wasn't the man she married, the friend told the court, that he was distant, cold, that she didn't feel safe anymore. Another friend testified that Sheri was preparing to leave Chris. She had spoken about moving in with her parents temporarily. She wasn't sure how to proceed, but she was gathering strength. She wanted a better future for her boys. These revelations were devastating. They suggested that Chris knew Sheri was slipping away, and if she left him, if she exposed his affair, his world would collapse. Prosecutors argued that this was the final trigger. Chris had spent years building an illusion, and he was willing to kill to protect it. The medical examiner's testimony further hammered the horror home. Sheri had injuries consistent with manual strangulation. It wasn't quick or painless. It took time. She fought back. Her fingers had traces of skin under the nails, Chris's skin. DNA sealed the connection. The boys, found tucked in their beds, showed no signs of waking. One was thought to have been killed while still asleep, his head resting on his pillow, his small arms curled inward in innocent slumber. The pathologist choked up when describing the scene. "This wasn't rage," he said. "It was methodical." Chris's defense team tried to paint a different picture. They said the evidence was circumstantial, that Chris had no criminal record, no violent history, that the graffiti could have been staged by someone else, that no one had seen Chris commit the murders. But jurors weren't persuaded. The sheer volume of damning details, technical data, witness testimony, psychological motive, created a case too powerful to ignore. When the verdict came down, guilty on all counts, Chris showed no emotion. No tears, no pleas, no breakdown. He stared ahead as if watching someone else's story unfold. To this day, Chris Coleman maintains his innocence. He claims he was framed, that someone else murdered his family, that the police were under pressure to find a scapegoat. But his appeals have failed. The evidence remains overwhelming. Meanwhile, Sheri's family has devoted themselves to preserving the memory of her and her sons. They established scholarships in Garrett and Gavin's names. They created a memorial at the site of the demolished home, a quiet garden where visitors can leave flowers, letters, and prayers. For the public, the case remains a haunting reminder of how evil can wear a familiar face. Chris wasn't a stranger in a dark alley. He wasn't a monster from a distant place. He was a father, a husband, a man people trusted. And in the silence of the early morning, he chose murder over truth, selfishness over love, image over humanity. And 3 innocent lives were stolen forever. The darkness that engulfed the Coleman household in May 2009 did not come suddenly. It had been building slowly, almost invisibly, under the surface for years. And now, with Chris Coleman sitting behind bars, convicted of first-degree murder, the nation remained fixated, not just on the tragedy, but on the deeper question: how did no one see this coming? To understand that, we must look at the years leading up to the crime. Chris and Sheri's marriage wasn't always fractured. In the early days, they seemed inseparable. Friends described them as a picture-perfect couple. Sheri, outgoing and nurturing; Chris, strong, quiet, and protective. Their life together began on a foundation of faith. They prayed together, attended church together, raised their boys with love and discipline. Chris's job with Joyce Meyer Ministries was prestigious, and Sheri took pride in his work. But as Chris rose in prominence, things began to change. His role meant constant travel, security detail for one of the most recognized Christian speakers in the world. He was in and out of hotels, on flights, backstage at events, surrounded by temptation and influence. Sheri, meanwhile, stayed home with the kids, managing everything from homework to birthdays. The distance between them wasn't just geographical, it was emotional. Friends later reported that Chris became more distant with each passing year. He grew increasingly critical of Sheri. He wanted her to dress differently, act differently. She once confided to a close friend that Chris told her she didn't look the part of a ministry wife. The implication was subtle but cruel. She wasn't good enough for the image he wanted to project. Despite this, Sheri never gave up on the marriage. She believed in their vows. She believed in forgiveness. But even her patience had limits. In 2008, she discovered an email on Chris's computer. It was from Tara Lintz, intimate, personal, and clearly romantic. Sheri confronted Chris. He dismissed it as nothing, claimed it was just talk, that it wouldn't happen again. He apologized, promised to be better. Sheri forgave him, but the trust was cracked. It wasn't the only sign. Chris began guarding his phone. He changed passwords. He became more irritable, more withdrawn. He slept in a separate room some nights. He told Sheri he needed space, that she was too emotional, too suspicious. Sheri started journaling around this time, a habit she had kept since her teenage years. In one entry, she wrote, "I feel like I don't even know the man I married. He looks the same, sounds the same, but it's like something inside him has shut off." Investigators would later retrieve that journal. It became a powerful piece of evidence, a window into a woman slowly losing her grip on the life she thought she had. At the same time, Chris's double life grew more intense. He and Tara Lintz were now fully immersed in their affair. They sent emails daily, many of them sexually explicit. They talked about wedding plans, about children. Chris promised her a new life, free of burdens. He even sent her photos of engagement rings, vacation spots, baby clothes. He told Tara the divorce papers were coming soon, that Sheri had agreed to end things amicably, that the boys would adjust. None of it was true. In reality, Chris had no intention of divorcing Sheri because he knew what that would cost him. A divorce would ruin his career with Joyce Meyer Ministries. Their moral code was strict, and Chris had signed an agreement upon employment. Any breach, adultery, criminal behavior, public scandal, would mean immediate termination. He also feared losing custody. Sheri was the primary caregiver. Chris traveled constantly. In court, he would have stood little chance of gaining full custody. And he knew that without the children, he had little control over the narrative. The image he so desperately clung to would be shattered. So, in the warped logic of a man consumed by ego and fear, Chris began to devise a solution, a final solution. He started sending threats, first to himself, then to Joyce Meyer Ministries. Anonymous emails warning that Sheri was in danger, that the family would pay for Chris's sins, that someone was watching. He saved the emails, reported them to his superiors, filed police reports. He was laying the groundwork for a plausible enemy, a nameless villain who would eventually become the scapegoat. Sheri, meanwhile, grew increasingly afraid. She began sleeping with the lights on. She asked neighbors to check on her when Chris was out of town. She installed extra locks. She told friends she had a bad feeling, that something wasn't right. In one of her final journal entries, Sheri wrote, "If something happens to me, look at Chris." It was a chilling sentence, written with dread, not certainty, but it would become a prophetic warning. Then came May 5th, 2009. Chris left for the gym just before 6 a.m. He drove his usual route, swiped his keycard at the gym entrance, worked out for over 40 minutes. All the while his phone remained in his locker. He told investigators he had tried calling Sheri and the boys during that time, but they never answered. When he returned home and saw the house quiet, he claimed he felt something was wrong. He called his police contact. Officers arrived and broke down the door. Inside, they found the bodies. Sheri was lying on her bed, bruises on her face, hands defensively positioned. The boys were in their beds, peaceful, motionless, already gone. Spray-painted messages were scrawled across the walls, angry, erratic, designed to look like the rantings of a killer with a grudge. But the paint was fresh. Too fresh. Investigators noted that it hadn't even dried by the time they arrived. Whoever had painted those words had done so very recently. Chris was questioned immediately. His demeanor was off. He didn't cry. He didn't ask to see the bodies. He didn't even ask if they were still alive. Instead, he asked about logistics, what needed to happen next, when he could retrieve his belongings. Detectives were already suspicious, but they needed proof. That proof came in waves. Digital forensics revealed that the threatening emails were sent from Chris's own laptop. Deleted drafts remained buried in the hard drive. The IP address traced back to his house. Spray paint cans were found in the basement. Fibers on his clothing matched residue from the cans. The timeline didn't add up. His phone records were incomplete. Surveillance footage showed him taking longer than usual to arrive at the gym. Experts concluded he likely killed his family between 3:45 and 5 o'clock a.m. before ever leaving home. The motive was clear. Chris believed he had no way out. Divorce meant disgrace, losing his job, losing control. And so he orchestrated the most horrific act imaginable, murdering his wife and children to preserve his image and free himself for a new life. During the trial, those who once supported Chris turned away in disbelief. Former co-workers at Joyce Meyer Ministries, once staunch defenders, fell silent. Some wept during testimony, others simply shook their heads. Sheri's family attended every day. Her parents, heartbroken but resolute, stared Chris down from the gallery. They wore pins with the boys' faces, held each other during the most graphic descriptions, prayed for strength. When the guilty verdict was read, there was no celebration, only solemn finality. Chris was sentenced to life in prison without parole. He would never walk free again, never see Tara, never reclaim the image he valued more than his family. But for Sheri's loved ones, justice was bittersweet. It couldn't bring back their daughter, or the boys with crooked smiles and sleepy eyes. It couldn't erase the nightmares. Still, they found ways to heal. Sheri's mother began speaking at domestic violence awareness events. She told audiences about the danger of hidden abuse, of control masked as love. She urged women to speak out, to seek help, to trust their instincts. The neighborhood in Columbia, Illinois, eventually demolished the Coleman home. Too many memories, too much pain. In its place, a memorial was built. 3 small trees planted in a triangle representing Sheri, Garrett, and Gavin. Visitors often leave trinkets, stuffed animals, crosses, handwritten notes. Some kneel and pray. Others just stand in silence, absorbing the stillness. In the years since, the story of the Coleman murders has been dissected by crime shows, podcasts, and documentaries. People remain fixated, trying to understand how such darkness could grow behind the walls of a seemingly ordinary home. But perhaps the lesson lies not in the crime, but in the cracks that preceded it. The controlling behavior, the emotional detachment, the obsession with image. The quiet isolation of a woman trying to hold her family together, even as it crumbled from within. Sheri Coleman and her sons did not die by accident. They died because someone who should have loved them the most chose his reputation over their lives. And no matter how many years pass, the echoes of that betrayal still resonate. The courtroom was packed. The trial of Christopher Coleman began in April 2011, nearly 2 years after the murders that tore through the quiet streets of Columbia, Illinois. What began as an unfathomable family tragedy had evolved into a national obsession. People lined up outside the courthouse, hoping for a seat inside. The media staked out every inch of space with cameras rolling, reporters whispering hurried updates into microphones, and true crime enthusiasts typing furiously on laptops. The eyes of a nation were now turned toward a single man who once protected a celebrity preacher, but now stood accused of the unthinkable. Chris Coleman sat at the defense table looking clean-cut, composed, and calculated, an eerie reflection of the image he had spent years trying to cultivate. Dressed in neatly pressed shirts and dress pants, his demeanor remained emotionless, save for the occasional downward glance. To some, he looked like a grieving husband and father. But to those who had followed the details, those who had seen the photos, read the emails, and listened to the cold phone calls, he looked like something far more chilling, a man devoid of remorse. The prosecution came prepared. They didn't just want to prove that Chris Coleman had motive, means, and opportunity. They wanted to strip away every mask he had ever worn, every lie he told, every image he cultivated. They needed to show the jury not just that he did it, but that he planned it with chilling precision. They began with the emails, the so-called death threats. Prosecutors called on digital forensic experts to the stand. These weren't just tech-savvy hobbyists. They were specialists trained to peel back digital footprints like layers of skin. They explained how the threats were sent from an account Chris had created, destroychrisgmail.com. At first glance, it seemed plausible, an enemy lurking in the digital shadows, but the forensic evidence told a different story. The emails were traced to Chris's laptop. The creation of the account occurred on a computer in his own home. Deleted drafts remained buried in his hard drive, proof that these weren't spontaneous threats from a stranger, but carefully rehearsed lies typed by Chris himself. The timestamps on the emails matched times when Chris had been alone. It was clear he had manufactured an elaborate hoax, and the digital trail was undeniable. Then came the timeline. On the morning of May 5, 2009, Chris claimed he went to the gym around 5:45 a.m., leaving his home while his wife and sons were still asleep. He said he tried calling them while at the gym but received no answer. When he returned home and found the house quiet, he called police, concerned that something was wrong. But surveillance footage from the gym painted a different picture. Chris arrived later than he claimed, and he didn't appear in distress. He took his time, greeting other gym-goers, performing his routine with calm precision. Police would later find his cell phone untouched in his locker, disproving his claim that he tried contacting his family. Back at the house, the killer had left a staged crime scene. Spray paint messages were scrawled on the walls, phrases like, "I am always watching," and "Punish Chris." But something about the paint didn't sit right with investigators. It was still wet when police arrived. Tests showed it had been sprayed minutes before the bodies were discovered, not hours. Whoever did it was in the house long after Chris claimed to have left. Then came the autopsy results. Dr. Raj Nanduri, the forensic pathologist who conducted the examinations, delivered disturbing testimony. Sheri Coleman had been strangled. Bruises on her arms and face suggested a violent struggle. Defensive wounds told a story of a woman who fought for her life. The boys, Garrett and Gavin, were also strangled in their sleep. There were no signs they ever woke up. They had been silenced before they could scream. Prosecutors argued that Chris likely murdered them in the early morning hours, between 3:30 and 5 o'clock a.m., before staging the fake threats and driving to the gym. His goal, they said, was to create an alibi, knowing that Joyce Meyer's strict policies on divorce and adultery would cost him his job, his reputation, and his mistress. Then came the affair. Tara Lentz took the stand, dressed in subdued tones, her voice trembling. She didn't try to justify her relationship with Chris. She admitted it was wrong, but her testimony revealed something even darker. Chris had told her that Sheri was in the way. He said his marriage was over, that Sheri was crazy. He sent her pictures of engagement rings, promised they'd be married soon, even told her that they would move to Hawaii together. Tara broke down in tears on the witness stand. She said she never asked Chris to harm anyone. She believed the divorce was real, that the separation was mutual. She never imagined he would kill his family. The jury listened in silence. Then the prosecutors dropped a bombshell. They presented a signed Code of Conduct agreement, an internal document from Joyce Meyer Ministries. Chris had signed it upon employment. It explicitly stated that any employee found guilty of adultery or immoral behavior would face immediate dismissal. There it was, in black and white. The motive. Chris couldn't afford a divorce, not if he wanted to keep his job, his image, or his control. So instead, he made a choice. He erased his family. The defense struggled to push back. They tried to cast doubt on the timeline. They questioned the credibility of some witnesses. They argued that the police rushed to judgment, but they had little to work with. The evidence was overwhelming, the forensics airtight, the motive glaring. After 5 weeks of testimony, the jury was sent to deliberate. It took them less than a day. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous, guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder. Chris Coleman showed no emotion. He didn't cry, didn't speak. He simply stood, as he had throughout the trial, expressionless, trapped behind the wall of his own making. During sentencing, Sheri's family gave victim impact statements. Her father's voice broke as he talked about his grandchildren, about Garrett's love for dinosaurs, Gavin's obsession with race cars. Sheri's mother described her daughter's smile, the way it lit up a room. The courtroom wept with them. The judge delivered the sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. Chris was led away in chains. His life, once filled with luxury, status, and power, was now reduced to a number behind bars. But the case didn't end there. After the trial, several lawsuits and motions followed. Sheri's family filed a wrongful death suit against Chris. They also pursued legal action to prevent him from profiting from the case in any way. No books, no interviews, no movies. The house where the murders took place stood vacant for years. Neighbors avoided it. Children crossed the street when passing. It became a haunted monument to a nightmare that no one could forget. Eventually, it was demolished. In its place, a small garden was planted. 3 stone markers were laid, each with a name: Sheri, Garrett, Gavin. Visitors sometimes leave flowers or small toys, a quiet tribute to lives taken too soon. The case continues to be studied in criminology courses, discussed in domestic violence seminars, and dissected in true crime media. It's a case that's remembered not just for the brutality of the act, but for the terrifying calm with which it was carried out. Chris Coleman wasn't a monster in the traditional sense. He was a man of God, a protector, a father, a husband. But somewhere along the way, he became something else, something dangerous. His mask didn't slip. He took it off willingly. And the world watched as the face beneath it destroyed everything. In the years following his conviction, Chris has remained mostly silent. He filed appeals, but all were denied. He spends his days in Menard Correctional Center, one of Illinois' highest security prisons. He has no access to social media, no public statements, no apologies. But for Sheri's family, the silence speaks volumes. They have devoted their lives to advocacy. Her parents created a foundation in her memory, promoting awareness about domestic violence and emotional abuse. They travel the country, speaking to churches, schools, and organizations. Their message is simple: abuse doesn't always leave bruises. Sometimes it leaves fear, confusion, and silence can kill. Sheri's story is now used in training programs for police and social workers. Her journal entries are studied as warning signs. Her life has become a cautionary tale, but also a symbol of strength. Because Sheri fought back. She spoke up. She confided in friends. She kept a record. She told someone to look at Chris if something happened. And in doing so, even in death, she helped build the case that brought him to justice. When the gavel fell and Chris Coleman was sentenced to life in prison, many assumed the story ended there. The public eye moved on. The media focused on newer crimes, fresher scandals. But for the families left behind, the echoes of that horrific May morning in 2009 never stopped. They reverberated through every memory, every holiday, every silent dinner. Justice was served, but healing was far more complicated. Sheri's parents, Ron and Angela Weiss, bore their grief with quiet dignity. They didn't scream at the cameras. They didn't launch vitriolic campaigns. Instead, they leaned into purpose. They channeled their heartbreak into something powerful. A mission to make sure what happened to their daughter and grandsons never happened to anyone else. They formed a nonprofit organization in Sheri's name, the Chris Coleman Foundation, dedicated to domestic violence, prevention and support for families facing emotional abuse. Their motto was as direct as it was haunting. Abuse doesn't always leave bruises. Through public speaking events, educational seminars, and advocacy at the state level, they began to educate others on the subtle signs of emotional manipulation, gaslighting, and psychological control. Things Sheri endured behind her husband's polished public image. The foundation's work took them across the country. Angela Weiss spoke to church congregations, warning them not to blindly trust the image a man projects simply because he quotes scripture. Ron appeared at police training academies, discussing the importance of listening to victims when they say something feels wrong, even when the perpetrator has no criminal history. Their pain became their voice, and that voice became a lifeline to others who felt trapped in the same quiet terror Sheri once lived with. Meanwhile, Chris Coleman adjusted to life behind bars. His prison, Menard Correctional Center, was known for housing some of the most violent offenders in Illinois. Located along the Mississippi River, the sprawling complex was surrounded by fences, barbed wire, and a lingering sense of despair. Here, Chris Coleman no longer enjoyed the status he once relished. He was not a celebrity's bodyguard. He was not a husband. He was not a father. He was inmate #B 85,914. Inside prison, Chris kept mostly to himself. Inmates often distanced themselves from child killers, considered the lowest on the prison hierarchy. While some murders were driven by impulse, poverty, or drug addiction, crimes against one's own children were seen as something entirely different, unforgivable. He was assigned a job in the prison's laundry facility. His days were repetitive: folding, stacking, cleaning, no cameras, no attention. Just silence. When news media attempted to contact him, he declined interviews. Perhaps he thought silence would help preserve what little image he had left. But silence was also his punishment, alone with his thoughts, alone with what he'd done. But beyond prison walls, the legal entanglements continued. In 2013, a wrongful death civil lawsuit filed by Sheri's family reached court. It wasn't about money. They knew they'd never receive any. It was about stripping Chris of any future opportunity to profit from his crime. No book deals, no movie rights, no sensational documentaries where he could tell his side of the story and rewrite history with self-pity. The court ruled in their favor. Any profits that could ever be made from the Chris Coleman case would legally be directed to Sheri's estate or blocked entirely. That same year, the house on 2854 Robert Drive, where the murders occurred, was finally demolished. For years, it had stood like a tombstone, a monument to horror. No one wanted to live there. The local homeowners association petitioned the city to have it removed, and finally, it was. In its place, a small public space was created. Locals called it Sheri's Garden. There were no plaques, no flashy signs, just a small wooden bench and a patch of wildflowers planted where the kitchen once stood. It became a quiet place to grieve, reflect, and remember. For Tara Lintz, the aftermath was especially painful. She had once believed she would marry Chris Coleman, that their love was real, that their future was just beginning. Instead, she became a reluctant figure in a tragedy she could never have imagined. After the trial, Tara vanished from the public eye. She moved away, changed jobs, and rarely spoke to the press. In one rare interview, she expressed deep remorse, not for being fooled, but for not recognizing the darkness in Chris sooner. She said she'd carry the weight of what happened for the rest of her life. Her testimony during the trial had been a double-edged sword, both a necessary piece of the prosecution's puzzle and a deeply painful public confession. The world saw her not as a woman in love, but as the mistress, a symbol of betrayal. But beneath that narrative was a person manipulated by a skilled liar who knew how to craft illusions with frightening ease. Chris Coleman had created a world in which he appeared to be a model husband and devout Christian. In truth, he was unraveling behind the scenes, juggling lies, spinning fantasies, and destroying the very family he claimed to protect. The psychological profile built by experts during the trial was as disturbing as it was revealing. Chris was described by forensic psychologists as a malignant narcissist, a person whose self-image was so fragile, so obsessed with control, that he'd rather eliminate obstacles than face failure or shame. To someone like Chris, divorce wasn't just inconvenient. It was a humiliation. Losing his job at Joyce Meyer Ministries meant losing his identity. Losing Sheri meant losing his narrative of perfection. His solution? Erase them. Rewrite the script. This mindset wasn't new. It had been developing for years. Investigators found messages Chris had sent long before the murders. Messages filled with cold logic and calculated manipulation. Emails to friends where he blamed Sheri for his unhappiness. Texts where he told lies about her mental state. Conversations where he painted himself as the victim, a man trapped in a loveless marriage. And yet, none of it was true. By all accounts, Sheri had been loving, loyal, and supportive, even when her husband withdrew emotionally, even when he became distant, even when he began staying out late, traveling more, pulling away from her and the boys. She had tried to make it work. She had suggested counseling. She kept journals documenting the growing tension. In one chilling entry, she wrote, "I'm starting to think he wants us gone." Her instincts were tragically accurate. In the years following the trial, several books were written about the case. One of the most prominent was Love, Lies, and Murder, which detailed the timeline with painstaking accuracy. Others focused on the broader theme of emotional abuse in religious communities, how churches sometimes fail to recognize or address warning signs when the abuser is someone respected or powerful. Podcasts, documentaries, and news specials kept the story alive. But Sheri's family made it clear. They didn't want to sensationalize what happened. They didn't want this to be about entertainment. They wanted awareness, prevention, change. And change did come. Illinois passed legislation that strengthened protections for domestic violence victims, making it easier for women to file protective orders, harder for abusers to manipulate custody cases, and providing more resources for women trapped in emotionally abusive relationships. Sheri's name appeared in hearings. Her story was used as a case study in legal and psychological courses. Her pain had sparked reform. As the years passed, the tragedy remained fresh in Columbia, Illinois. Neighbors still remembered the sirens that morning, the police tape, the hushed whispers at church services. Many said they felt betrayed. How could they not have seen the signs? How did someone so polished, so kind on the surface, harbor such violence beneath? But evil doesn't always arrive wearing a mask. Sometimes it wears a smile. Sometimes it quotes scripture. Sometimes it plays with your children and shows up at barbecues. That's what made Chris Coleman's crime so terrifying. It wasn't just the act, it was the deception. The boys, Garrett and Gavin, would have been teenagers today. Photos of them as smiling, innocent children remain etched in public memory. Garrett, the older brother, loved superheroes and dinosaurs. He once told a friend he wanted to be a hero like his dad when he grew up. Gavin, the youngest, had boundless energy and a mischievous grin. They were not just victims. They were little lives filled with hope and laughter, wiped out before they had a chance to become who they were meant to be. Sheri was just 31 when she died. She had been married to Chris for over a decade, had stood beside him through his career, his deployments, his rise in the Joyce Meyer empire. But in the end, the very man she supported became her executioner. Still, she is remembered not for how she died, but for how she lived. Her friends describe her as compassionate, funny, full of life. She was the kind of mother who packed surprise notes in her kids' lunches, the kind of woman who remembered birthdays, who organized charity events, who always made others feel seen. Sheri's story is told now in classrooms, seminars, and podcasts. But more than that, it's told in the quiet strength of the people she left behind, People who refused to let her name be buried under headlines or forgotten in a prison file. Because what happened in that house in Colombia wasn't just a tragedy, it was a warning. A warning that evil doesn't always come crashing through the window. Sometimes it walks in the front door with a briefcase and a Bible. Sometimes it says, "I love you," before turning out the lights. But the truth, once hidden beneath lies, once buried under manipulation, found its way to the surface. And it screamed louder than Chris Coleman ever could. As the years unraveled and the media attention slowly quieted, one question continued to linger in the minds of those who had followed the Chris Coleman case closely. How could a man who preached faith, worked for a global ministry, and fathered 2 children commit one of the most horrifying acts of familial betrayal in modern American crime? The answer wasn't simple. It lay tangled in the psychology of control, the mask of religious authority, and the frightening ease with which a lie can become a lifestyle. Chris Coleman's relationship with faith had always been publicly prominent. He wasn't just a believer. He was the face of Christian discipline to those around him. As Joyce Meyer's personal bodyguard, he exuded the image of strength, loyalty, and unwavering conviction. He was a man paid to protect others. But what many didn't see was that faith, to Chris, wasn't about devotion. It was about identity. It was his armor, his script, and more dangerously, his shield. From early adulthood, Chris had learned that religious image could open doors. Through church circles, he found validation, community, and respect. But underneath that projection was a man increasingly detached from empathy, one who learned how to mirror the right behaviors while burying his real motives. In private, according to testimony and letters later reviewed, Chris struggled with impulse control and an inflated sense of self-importance. He often felt trapped in obligations, his marriage, his responsibilities, his image. Yet he refused to consider paths that would jeopardize how others viewed him. A divorce wasn't just messy, it was humiliating, and humiliation to Chris felt like death. To maintain the illusion, he began compartmentalizing his life. Church on Sunday, lies on Monday, domestic life at home, passionate emails to Tara Lynn's from hotel rooms. He juggled worlds, each with its own language, its own expectations. When cracks started to show, he didn't pull back, he doubled down. That compartmentalization reached a terrifying crescendo with the anonymous threats that surfaced months before the murders. In retrospect, these messages weren't just a distraction tactic. They were Chris laying groundwork, crafting a storyline, shaping the narrative that he would later point to as the cause of tragedy. He wrote the threats to himself, hoping to build an alibi. But what it really showed was how deeply immersed he was in the performance of innocence. The investigation revealed how detailed his manipulation had become. The emails came from an account he created. The grammar, the tone, the pacing, all carefully curated to seem like a stalker, obsessed with Sheri's public role as the wife of a Joyce Meyer employee. He planted the idea of religious resentment and targeted hatred, but the deeper authorities dug, the more the logic collapsed. How would a supposed religious extremist know exactly when Chris would be away for work? Why would they escalate their threats in perfect sync with Chris's increasing frustration with Sheri? Why were there no fingerprints, no outside traces, only digital breadcrumbs that led right back to his own laptop? Chris had orchestrated everything under the false assumption that he was the smartest man in the room. But pride, as investigators often say, is a criminal's Achilles heel. And then there was the timeline, the part of the case that left even seasoned detectives chilled. On the morning of May 5, 2009, Chris left for the gym at 5:43 a.m. Surveillance cameras confirmed his presence there. But what he didn't anticipate was how the technology he hoped would protect him, his own home security system, would expose him. The Coleman's alarm system had timestamps of every door opened, every movement inside the house. When police matched those logs with Chris's movements, discrepancies emerged. There were activity records in the house when Chris claimed no one was home but the victims. He had, in essence, created a digital alibi that contradicted itself. That overconfidence led prosecutors to call his actions sloppy for someone who thought he was a mastermind. He had focused so much on staging the crime scene, he forgot the simple details: the phone calls, the deleted messages, the typos, and the threats that matched his own emails. One of the more haunting pieces of evidence came from a surveillance photo taken as he left the gym. He looked relaxed, focused, no signs of panic, no urgency in his movements. Less than an hour later, police found his wife and 2 sons murdered in their beds. And yet he didn't call 911. He called a police officer friend. He waited outside, claimed to be afraid to enter the house, a facade. That calm demeanor became a cornerstone of the prosecution's argument. A man who just lost his entire family, the prosecutor told the jury, should be inconsolable, not calculating. In closing arguments, the district attorney said, Chris Coleman didn't snap. He planned. He didn't lose control. He exercised it. Every moment, every action, every threat was a step toward this outcome. He didn't kill out of passion. He killed out of convenience. And that's what horrified people the most. Because this wasn't a crime of rage. It wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate, premeditated execution of 3 innocent lives, all to avoid the embarrassment of a divorce. A clean break that could have spared everyone. In prison, Chris Coleman has remained largely silent, but silence isn't peace. Inside Menard Correctional, he has been described by guards as emotionless, distant, and detached. He keeps to himself, avoids eye contact, rarely interacts. Some believe it's his way of coping. Others say it's narcissism, an unwillingness to acknowledge the destruction he caused. One inmate who spent time in the same block described Chris as the kind of guy who still thinks he did the right thing. Whether that's true or prison folklore is hard to say, but what's certain is that Chris has never publicly expressed remorse. Not in court, not in prison, not in letters. Sheri's family, meanwhile, has done what they can to restore her legacy. Through the foundation, they've published journals, funded counseling programs, and partnered with domestic violence shelters across the Midwest. Every year on the anniversary of the murders, they hold a private vigil, lighting 3 candles, one for Sheri, one for Garrett, and one for Gavin. Friends and neighbors gather quietly, no cameras, just memories. One former neighbor said, "We don't want people to remember the horror. We want them to remember the joy. The way Garrett used to ride his bike up and down the street. The way Sheri decorated for Halloween. The way Gavin would run barefoot through the yard. That's what lives here now, not fear, not hate, just remembrance." Yet the case continues to be taught in criminal justice programs. It's a chilling example of family annihilation, a term used to describe a subset of killers who eliminate their entire family, often to start a new life or escape perceived shame. While the motives vary, the common thread is control, the belief that one has the right to decide who lives and who dies based on personal convenience. Chris Coleman's case fits the model almost perfectly. The lead criminologist who studied the case wrote, "He didn't want to lose his status. He didn't want to be the guy who failed in marriage, so he rewrote the narrative, with a final chapter that only he survived." It's sobering insight into a type of personality that can go unnoticed, because it hides it in plain sight. Even now, a decade later, people who knew Chris struggle to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the man who committed these crimes. Some church members refuse to speak about it, as if uttering his name might make the nightmare resurface. Others use his story as a warning about blind trust, about appearances, about the quiet violence of emotional manipulation. But one truth remains unshakable. Sheri and her boys deserve to live. They deserve birthdays, graduations, family vacations, and bedtime stories. They were not collateral damage in a man's personal rebranding. They were a family, vibrant, beautiful, and full of promise. Their story has become a symbol, not of tragedy, but of resilience. It serves as a call to action, to take threats seriously, to recognize the signs of control and gaslighting, and to never underestimate the danger of unchecked ego. Because if a man like Chris Coleman could build a life of lies so carefully, so convincingly, then anyone can be deceived. And if we don't learn from it, it could happen again. The courtroom was quiet when the final verdict echoed through the halls of justice in Waterloo, Illinois. A unanimous decision. Guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder. Chris Coleman, once a decorated Marine and trusted guardian of one of the most recognizable evangelists in the country, stood motionless as the weight of the judgment settled around him. The jury had taken only a few hours to decide. The evidence was overwhelming, the motive cold and clear, but still the gravity of the moment lingered in the air like smoke. It wasn't just the condemnation of a man. It was the exposure of a life meticulously staged, the end of a deception so deeply rooted in image that it had fooled even those closest to him. Chris was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, no appeal, no chance at redemption in the eyes of the law. For many, it felt like justice. For others, it raised haunting questions. How do you prevent such evil when it hides in plain sight? How do you truly know anyone? But justice in the legal sense did not mean peace for Sheri's family. They were left to navigate a shattered world without the laughter of children or the warmth of their daughter. Sheri's parents, Don and Angela, had not only lost their only child, but also their grandsons, their legacy. For them, life would always be before and after May 5th, 2009. Their grief transformed into purpose. They launched the Sheri Coleman Foundation, aimed at educating communities about domestic violence, coercive control, and the warning signs of emotional manipulation. It was their way of reclaiming a future from the ruins of their past. They spoke at schools, churches, conferences, anywhere someone would listen. Their mission was simple: don't let another family fall to silence. Meanwhile, the true crime community took a lasting interest in the Coleman case. It was the kind of story that defied stereotypes. Chris wasn't a drifter or an addict. He wasn't unstable in the traditional sense. He was clean-cut, religious, respected. The very things that once made him trustworthy were the same things that allowed him to manipulate those around him without suspicion. And criminologists categorize him as a family annihilator with narcissistic features. This label, cold and clinical, masked the horror of what that truly meant. Family annihilators are rare. Most often men, they operate with a warped logic. If they can't control their world, no one else can have it either. They kill to eliminate perceived burdens, to escape shame, or, most chillingly, to start over. Chris Coleman fit that mold in every way. He didn't want a divorce because it would make him look weak. He didn't want to quit his job because it offered status. And he didn't want to live a double life. So, in his mind, the only solution was erasure, a brutal, irreversible cleansing of his past, so he could create a new future with Tara Lentz, free of guilt, free of responsibility, and most importantly, free of judgment. It was a plan that made sense only to him. One question persisted among both legal analysts and the public. Did Tara Lentz know? Tara was interrogated extensively. Investigators scoured her emails, phone records, and online activity. While her relationship with Chris was undeniably intimate, and her emails revealed eagerness to start a life with him, there was no evidence that she was aware of his intentions. No hint she knew about the threats, the planning, or the ultimate act. She was, by all appearances, a pawn in his fantasy, a future he had built in his mind using stolen moments and seductive promises. In the weeks following the trial, Tara disappeared from public view. The woman who once posed for bikini photos and dreamed of a Florida life with Chris now lived in the shadow of a triple homicide. Her name, forever linked to a nightmare she didn't create, became a cautionary tale. Know who you love, know what they're capable of. The media gradually moved on, as it always does. New cases emerged. New tragedies. The headlines shifted. But in Columbia, Illinois, the echoes of that morning never faded. The Coleman home was eventually demolished. Too stained with horror to be resold, the property sat vacant for years before city officials finally razed it. Where once stood a 2-story house with a backyard playset and flower beds, now lay an empty lot. Overgrown grass, faint outlines of a foundation, a blank space that says, more than any monument could. For locals, it became a scar, one they didn't want reopened. Some neighbors who once waved to the Colemans each morning moved away. Others stayed but changed the subject when asked. No one wanted to talk about the red spray paint, the camera footage, the chilling last photo of Garrett smiling days before the end. They wanted to remember Sheri, not how she died, but how she lived. Her friends describe her as sunshine in human form, a mother who packed lunches with notes, who organized school events, who volunteered in the community not out of obligation, but joy. She sang in the church choir. She baked. She was the kind of woman whose absence was immediately felt. Her sons, too, had legacies that lived on in the memories of classmates and teachers. Garrett, the older one, loved dinosaurs. He wanted to be a paleontologist. Gavin, younger and more rambunctious, had a fascination with toy trains and mischief. They were boys full of promise, robbed of every milestone that lay ahead. In documentaries and articles, their faces remain frozen in time. School portraits and family vacation shots. Smiling, unaware of the darkness brewing just behind the man they called Dad. Chris Coleman, now years into his life sentence at Menard Correctional Center, continues to live under the radar. He doesn't give interviews. He doesn't make headlines. He exists in the gray shadows of the prison system, just another number in a sea of broken lives. But those who study such men know the silence is part of the pathology. They don't apologize, they don't acknowledge guilt, because doing so would mean losing the last thing they have, the illusion of control. In one of the final letters Chris sent before the trial, he wrote a line that chilled investigators. Sometimes the hardest thing to do is what's necessary. To some, it read as justification. To others, as a confession. To Sheri's parents, it was proof of a man so lost in ego that he truly believed the slaughter of his family was somehow necessary. A horrifying glimpse into a mind that valued self-image over human life. The Chris Coleman case became a landmark, not just for its brutality, but for what it revealed about the nature of evil. Evil isn't always loud. It doesn't always wear black or show up in mugshots. Sometimes it wears a suit. Sometimes it stands beside a pulpit. Sometimes it kisses its children goodnight with a smile and wakes up the next day planning their murder. And that realization shattered illusions across America. Churches began reevaluating their staff accountability procedures. Ministries implemented psychological screening. And law enforcement officials cited the Coleman case in training sessions about domestic threats disguised as external dangers. The legacy of this crime rippled far beyond Illinois. It forced a national conversation about how much we trust based on appearance. Chris Coleman is still alive, but his world is gone. The lies he built collapsed, the fantasy he chased turned to ash, and the life he wanted with Tara never came to pass. She moved on. Sheri's family rebuilt, and the community he deceived learned to live without him. In the end, he has nothing but time. Time to relive the choices that brought him here. Time to consider the weight of silence. And time to understand that, for all his planning, all his manipulation, he underestimated the strength of truth. Because truth, unlike lies, doesn't require memory. It doesn't change under pressure. It survives cross-examination and public scrutiny. It stands firm, no matter how elaborate the deception. As the final chapter of the Coleman case closes, what remains is not just a story of tragedy, it's a warning. A warning about unchecked control, about the masks we wear, and about the families that fall when love becomes possession. But it is also a tribute to Sheri, Garrett, and Gavin, a tribute to their lives, their love, and their light. A vow from those left behind to never forget. To remember that behind every smile may lie a story untold, and to ensure that never again will a man be allowed to weaponize trust in the name of control.